Welcome back. You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. The BBC Director General, Tim Davie, and the Chief Executive of BBC News, Deborah Turness, have both resigned after a Donald Trump speech was edited in a Panorama documentary, misleading the audience. The government has admitted that wrongful prison releases have increased under Labour, but insist they're getting to grips with the crisis. And the King has led the 4 home nations in a 2-minute silence on the 80th Remembrance Sunday since the end of the Second World War. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with broadcaster and commentator Matt Stadlen and writer and broadcaster Angela Epstein. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, The Guardian opens with BBC Director General Tim Davie stepping down after the corporation was accused of biased coverage. The FT features the same leading story, writing that Davie resigned after days of criticism over misleading edits of a speech made by Donald Trump. The Daily Mail went with the same, also showing Resign News CEO Deborah Turness on the cover. The Times also leads with the BBC's outgoing Davie and Turness. The Telegraph also has the BBC story, taking credit for the investigation that led to the boss's resignation. The iPaper focuses on the same breaking story. Same lead over at the Express and the same story at the Sun. The Metro leads with King Charles tearing up while mourning Britain's fallen soldiers at the cenotaph. The Daily Star spotlights Britain's tallest Tory. And the Mirror, Trump row, BBC boss, I quit. I'm just wondering how they can confirm that he is in fact the tallest Tory.
Not a lettuce.
Shall we just spend the next 20 minutes talking about tall Tories?
You're tall. You're taller than me.
I'm not a Tory, though.
OK.
Yeah.
You got the suit.
Not the full description there. OK, well, let's get to the actual stories that we're going to be talking about, and obviously what we've been leading on, and that's the resignation of Tim Davie and also the CEO of News, Deborah Turness. Front page of all the papers, I think, bar none. We'll start with the Daily Telegraph. Matt, take us into their coverage. Oh, there we are. Takes into their coverage, obviously a vested interest, because the story came back in the Telegraph earlier in the week.
Yeah, and the Telegraph clearly is a competitor to the BBC, certainly when it comes to its website, because it wants eyeballs. So it's not as though it doesn't, I would suggest, have some skin in this game. Nonetheless, it's a big story. It was broken by the Telegraph, and no doubt they'll be delighted that this is making international headlines. It is a bad day for the BBC. I'm absolutely clear about that. I worked for the BBC for 8.5 years in total. I was very proud to work for the BBC. And because it's a bad day for the BBC, it's a bad day for us, because this is a public service broadcaster that we pay for, that is there to serve us. And while it is absolutely right, therefore, that the BBC is properly scrutinised and is held to account, I would suggest there's something else going on here as well. And there are certainly forces out there, I would say largely on the right, although it's often criticised on the left, who would love to see the destruction or the diminishment of the BBC. And I think we should also be clear about that.
Would you be proud to say that you work for the BBC today?
It's difficult for me to understand the extent of the issues from the outside. Clearly, an organisation with so many thousands of people working there is going to have issues from time to time, and this particular documentary seems to be an issue. It was very poorly edited. I was interested to discover, reading about this in recent days, that it seems to have been produced, this Panorama, by an independent television company. And I would have thought that news material of this sort of weight, talking about US presidents and presidential elections, I would have thought and hoped and actually expected that it would be made in-house. When I worked at the BBC, I was imbued with the BBC's editorial guidelines, and it's much easier, I would suggest, taking those extremely seriously if you are actually part of that organisation. I think it's also interesting that Tim Davie, he wasn't really a news man. He had partly a corporate background. He headed up, I think, BBC Audio. And I would suggest that the next Director General probably has to have a very strong foot in news.
Angela, that's something that Alan Rusbridger said this evening, that really you need a journalist. So it's two hats, the journalistic hat and the corporate hat. And perhaps the job is too big for one person. It does need to be split in two.
Well, maybe, but I think Tim Davie has been complacent, he's been weak, and he's failed in the job that he was given to do. As far back as when the Glastonbury thing happened with Bob Vyland, he was there, he was present, when they made these incendiary remarks, and his failure to order that the live stream should be pulled, this is reported in the Telegraph, was just another egregious example of the appalling state of editorial guidelines at the BBC. We have seen systematic bias at the BBC, and there is no desire, I would say respectfully, I'm on the right to you, although I'm sitting on the left tonight, in terms of my politics. It gives me no pleasure, I grew up with the BBC, to see this dark day for the BBC. But there's a whole roll call of egregious occurrences that have happened under his watch. And we've got the paradox of this global brand, and yet its reputation is in tatters. Just looking, for example, at one thing, and we go to the Guardian headline, it says Davie steps down over panorama row. So that's obviously been the trigger or the cliched straw that broke the camel's back. But there is a most terrible, roll call of systematic bias. You've got the acceptance of the trans ideology that's been sort of covered without any kind of robust prosecution or investigation. And for me personally, although looking at it generally, the reporting on the Middle East has been so skewered, and it's had implications, and that's the bigger thing. Remember, we pay for the BBC. As Matt said, it's a public-funded broadcaster. So they refuse to call Hamas terrorists. When we go back to right at the early stages of the war, when there was the rocket, if you remember, that fell on the Al-Halil hospital, the BBC rushed to blame Israel, and then robust evidence became clear that it was a Palestinian rocket, a jihadi rocket that had misfired. Jeremy Bowen still refused to apologise, even though that he had been one, along with John Dennison, who had said, it must be Israel. We don't know, but it must be Israel. That led to spikes in anti-Israel protest around the world and terrorist attacks in Berlin, and I think it was Toronto. Forgive me if I've got the other city wrong. The fact is, that has an implication, and a number of Jewish friends have said to me, it's anecdotal, understandably, they said, why are we paying for a licence fee that gives ammunition to anti-Semites? Now, Tim Davie has been told about this over and over again. I personally chaired the largest meeting of Jewish people to call senior members of the BBC to account. There was a huge event in Manchester led by an organisation called the Northern Advocacy Group. And these senior executives sat there and said, we don't have a problem. And if at some point along the line, way before we get to Panorama, which is obviously covered at the front of the Guardian, then this could have stopped. But like I said, complacency, weakness, or I used to call him Teflon Tim, because nothing seemed to stick.
We could
Matt,
have an hour or many hours debating what's going on in Gaza and Israel, and also coverage. And of course, traditionally, historically, the BBC has been criticised by those who would identify more with the Palestinian side, in inverted commas, and also criticised by people who would identify more with the Israeli side. It's an immensely contentious and extremely difficult issue over the decades, and the BBC often finds itself at the heart of that battlefront. What I would say is, going back to my earlier point about, I suppose, the delight, the relish with which this story will now be reported in some quarters. We've got the President of the United States, and let's remember this story that was, it seems, misedited, revolved around what President Trump did or didn't say on that fateful day, January the 6th, 2021, where he did deliberately, in my view, attempt to undermine American democracy. He was refusing to accept the result of that democratic election, and he was encouraging, I'm not saying to be violent, but he was encouraging supporters to go and protest at the Capitol. That was, in my view, profoundly anti-democratic. And now we have the President of the United States, who has been found to have told untruths or falsehoods thousands of times, accusing others of dishonesty and accusing others of undermining democracy. That is rank hypocrisy.
But just to say that the Panorama clip that was edited, two separate clips, however many minutes, I think it was 43 minutes apart, That was dishonest.
I'm not defending that. What I'm saying is, if you look at who is now attacking the BBC, one of the most principled people who is doing that is President Trump, who's the most powerful person in the world. We know as a fact that he has told vast numbers of untruths, that he has been profoundly dishonest, and we also know that he refused to accept his own election defeat. So for him to accuse the BBC of being anti-democratic, as I say, is rank hypocrisy.
I think, Matt, you do. All the honest, hard-working people who pay their £175 licence fee, respectfully...
Such as myself.
Such as yourself. A huge disservice, because we can argue about Trump's ethics and his standing, and the argument actually is, the pub talk is, he didn't need the panorama thing, because he's, you know, you let your enemy make their own mistakes, ultimately they'll trip over themselves anyway.
The BBC is not the enemy of Donald Trump.
No, but
it is not. It's a great British institution.
I'll let you finish. Please allow me to finish. The point is, Tim Davie has resigned because of accusations of bias, as we've discussed, and the fact that there was a doctored clip ahead of the Capitol riots. Now, the rights and wrongs of Trump's ethical stance are irrelevant here. Yes, you can say that he's not a principled man, therefore his views of the BBC are irrelevant. Forget what he says. There is empirical evidence to show that there was a gross failing of editorial standards. It is absolutely outrageous.
So what does... Sorry, I'm going to respond to that. You've just told me I do a disservice to licence fee payers, of which I am one. I have myself criticised the editing of that panorama clip. I'm trying to step back from this and say, while the BBC obviously has to be scrutinised and held to account, of course it does, it's our money, as you say, at the same time, let's look at the forces who are relishing in bringing it down.
I'm going to bring it to a close there, but you do both agree that the Panorama documentary was a huge mistake there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to leave it on that point, because we're running out of time. We're going to take a break. Coming up, the front of the Metro features the King's emotional salute at the Cenotaph for Remembrance Sunday. Stay with us.
Liberation Day.
By popular demand, here we are.
Donald Trump. It is quite the story. Wherever it goes, on Trump 100, we go with it.
Tell us who you're looking for.
Unbelievable we've come to this.
Are you overstating the reach and significance of this deal?
Not like you said it.
From the UK.
Why don't you go back to your country where you have a major migrant problem?
It was 10 feet from him, and all of a sudden the shot's running out.
People impacted.
I'll tell you on another day on the podcast what that was all about.
Join us wherever you get your podcast.
We've come to one of Moscow's Cold War bunkers. It was built as a top-secret command centre. Being here really feels like you're stepping back in time. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent. A show of military might and menace. Courage, bravery and sacrifice will win the day. It's a new subject. They'll learn about combat drones and some how to handle a Kalashnikov. The Kremlin continues to put forward its own version of events, both present and past. There's no mention of the fact that Russia invaded its neighbour. That's rewriting history, isn't it?
Now we have to read it carefully.
Vladimir Putin put forward his plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, telling Kiev, pull out of your eastern territories and the war will end. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Vladimir Putin is already the Kremlin's longest-serving leader since Stalin. The question is, what will a fifth Putin term mean for Russia and the world? Why do you support Vladimir Putin, Mr. Segal?
I can't answer questions that stupid.
I've watched Vladimir Putin attempt to create a new world order. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West. Ambassador, I wonder, shall we have a quick word for Sky News? Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine?
Swedish media, oh my God, you're not afraid of being here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display. Russia says Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed, but has never produced any evidence to back that up. Sky News. Get the full story first.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film. But it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Matt Stadlen and Angela Epstein. Let's take a look at the front page of the Metro. And the photo there of the King, emotional salute at the Cenotaph. Very touching photo,
It really was. It really was. I think on a day when we've, without trying to be cute, on a day when we've seen some really grim behaviour, you know, certainly in terms of weakness, poor decision-making, we remember the really, really kind of tough things that people have done in lives, the ultimate sacrifice that was made. This is obviously very important, the BBC stuff, but this was... We're remembering now predominantly the Second World War veterans this year because it was 80 years since the end of the conflict. And it's just so profoundly moving. It's almost hard to find the words that give it the kind of description it deserves because we've become so complacent, we've used that word a few times this evening, about our freedom, about the fact that we can, you know, go 2 rounds over what we think about the BBC. We're here and we can do that because of the ultimate sacrifice.
Thank God, yeah. No, I think it is a bit sad that this massive BBC story is broken today for 2 reasons. One is that the news cycle just doesn't stop for anyone or anything. And today, one would hope, is a day where we can reflect on those who gave their lives and sacrificed so much so that we can continue to... not that so Andrew and I can to have an argument, but so that people up and down the land, in living rooms, in TV studios, in the street, on social media, can speak freely, can engage with each other, can disagree. But I would also say that it's sad that, in my view, a great British institution in the shape of the BBC that has done so much for us here is so important in a world of AI and misinformation and disinformation. It's so important that we have a trusted BBC, and I would suggest that for the much the greatest part, it is that. It's done so much for our reputation around the world. It is now being dragged through the mud, partly, yeah, through its own fault, but also because there are forces that want to bring it down or diminish it. And today should be a day where we are proud to be British and proud of those who fought for us.
And the irony is that the BBC had such a seminal role during the war for the dissemination of information. If you think, for example, the landmark reportage that came out of Belsen when Richard Dimbleby went in. As it happens, ironically, the BBC didn't want him to broadcast it originally because he saw the atrocities that had happened as a consequence of the Nazi genocide, and he threatened to resign. But that film that exists...
It wasn't a genocide, it was a Holocaust.
Well, we can split. I would say the two are the same thing. But the fact is that he brought to the world... That was the BBC, bringing information to the world during the war.
Angela and Matt, thank you very much for taking us through the papers.